Imagine you are in a trench in the pitch black in a country far away from home, fighting alongside people who don't even speak the same language, not knowing what is going to happen from day to day, wondering if you're going to make it back home to see your family, but knowing when you go home that the country that you risked your life for is still really racist and not going to be there to support you. These are just some of the major issues that Henry Johnson and the Harlem Hellfighters faced during World War I. Henry Johnson was born around July 15, 1892. Not much else is known about his early life, aside from the fact he lived in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He moved to New York in hoping finding work. He had multiple different jobs, ranging from a soda mixer to a railway porter. Before joining the Army, Johnson got married and had 3 kids. He enlisted on June 15, 1917. He became a part of the 369th, aka the Harlem Hellfighters, an all-black regiment from New York. Even though Henry Johnson had great triumphs on the battlefield, he still faced racism in the Army and struggled when he returned home to go back to his everyday life. During World War I, the Army was still segregated. This led to African American and white soldiers being treated differently. For starters, in New York, where Henry Johnson joined the Army, they were only allowed to have 4 all-black regiments in the National Guard. The soldiers in these regiments were treated badly from their fellow American soldiers, especially those white soldiers from the South who really hated seeing African American in uniforms. Many of them were still angry about the Civil War. The African American soldiers were never given training for battle from the Americans, and some received very little training when they were given in the French Army. When they went to Europe, their jobs were to unload ships and dig latrines. The Hellfighters did labor work from January of 1918 to the end of March that same year. The 369th was lent to the French Army in April of 1918. One of the reasons for this was because the French needed men, but also the fact that the white American soldiers did not want to fight alongside African American soldiers. American officers then gave French officers a pamphlet known as Sick Bat. In it, it told the French army how to treat the African American soldiers. It told them not to eat with them and not to encourage them, because it might lead them to thinking that they are equal or better than they are, which would lead to problems back home. This did not stop the French army from welcoming the able bodies. The French treated the African American soldiers like equals, despite what the white Americans said. Henry Johnson was not someone that if you saw on the street, you would think he could be a hero. Standing only 5 feet 4 inches, he was not your average-looking soldier, but he was more than your average soldier. He was a hellfighter. On the night of May 15, 1918, Johnson, along with another American soldier named Needham Roberts, were in a foxhole in charge of watching the line, making sure no Germans would try to take control of the French trench. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, they heard something that sounded like barbed wire being cut. Johnson told Roberts to go and tell someone while he threw a grenade over. The Germans then responded with gunfire and grenades of their own. Roberts was injured but stayed with Johnson and handed him grenades until they ran out. Johnson then took his rifle and started shooting out into the night, hoping to hit something. This worked until he jammed his rifle, so he started using it as a club, hitting any Germans he could. He only collapsed for a moment until he saw Germans trying to take Roberts as a prisoner. He got up and took out his bullets knife, a last resort weapon. Johnson kept fighting until some French soldiers came to help. Only then did he stop fighting. The whole thing lasted an hour, and he sustained 21 wounds. But the more impressive thing was he killed 4 Germans and wounded anywhere from 12 to 24 other Germans. He was later awarded the Croix de Guerre, which is the highest military honor in France. He was the first American, white or black, to ever be awarded this award. He later had this to say about the whole ordeal. There wasn't anything so fine about it. Just fought for my life. A rabbit would have done that. He also said, each slash meant something. Believe me, I wasn't doing exercise. Let me tell you. The Harlem Hellfighters were later all awarded the Croix de Guerre. They also were one of or the least trained regiments in the Army, and yet they never lost a prisoner, trench, or foot of ground in the 91 days that they saw combat, which was more than any other American regiment in the war. But seeing all that combat also meant that they had the most casualties. Around 1,400 men lost their lives from the 369th. Another impressive thing about the Harlem Hellfighters was their regiment band. They had one of the best, if not the best, military bands. While in France, they would go around playing, giving people the first real taste of jazz music. The band leader was named James Reese Europe. Was their band leader, but also the only African-American infantry officer from the 369th. When they came back to the United States, the band went on tours all over the country. Sadly, while in Boston, Europe got into a fight with one of the drummers. One of the drummers took out a knife and slashed his throat and killed him. Even though the 369th and Henry Johnson did heroic things over in Europe, it was a struggle to try to get back to their everyday lives after the war. When the soldiers returned home from war, there were parades welcoming them home, but they were segregated. Even the wounded soldiers would participate in these parades, being driven by cars. Johnson, one of the soldiers riding in the cars, was so moved by the number of people that came out to see them, he stood up with flowers in his hand. They said that day, not even the steel plate in his foot could hold him down. When he first came home, Johnson went on tours to talk about what it was like in the war, how well the white and black American soldiers got along, which was a lie. Sadly, it did not take long for the white Americans to forget about the African American soldiers during World War I. Even Johnson was soon forgotten by these white Americans. The Hellfighters had a really hard time finding jobs and homes after the war, which affected them and their families. Many came back with physical and mental issues, which made it very hard for them to find work. Johnson tried to go back to work as a railroad porter, but did not last very long. Because of the injuries that he got during the war, he had to get a metal plate in his foot to keep it together, which made it impossible to work. He did not get any money from the government as well, because none of his injuries were recorded. This also meant he could not receive the Purple Heart. Because of this issue, Johnson turned to drinking to cope with everything. This led to his wife and his children leaving him. He then died alone and poor in 1929. He was buried unbeknown to his family in Arlington National Cemetery, because he was buried under the wrong name. It was not until 1996 that Johnson got any awards from the U.S. government. He got the Purple Heart in 1996, the Distinguished Service Cross in 2002, and in 2015 he was awarded the Medal of Honor, which is the highest military honor someone can receive in the U.S. Because of Henry Johnson and the Harlem Hellfighters and their legacy, things started to change for African Americans. Things did not change immediately for them, but because of their bravery and fighting spirit in World War I, it gave way to more opportunity for other American soldiers and people. It led to the desegregation of the Army during the Korean War, which was 32 years after the end of World War I. Their legacy also helped during the Civil Rights Movement. The story of Henry Johnson and the Harlem Hellfighters needs to be one for the history books. These were men that risked their lives for their country, a country at the time did not even want them fighting. Keeping their story around and teaching it to people will help stop it from happening again.
Him down to. And finally, reinforcements arrived, and the last enemy soldier fled. As the sun rose, the scale of what happened became clear. In just a few minutes of fighting, 2 Americans defeated an entire raiding party, and Henry Johnson saved his fellow soldier from being taken prisoner. And 97 years after his extraordinary acts of courage and selflessness, I'm proud to award him the Medal of Honor.